So this, good readers, is the 2019 Burton skeleton key. And this skeleton key is not too much different from the 17 I owned. I just gave that to Grant. He loved it to death. And you know, this is just like same shape, same almost everything, only some very minor differences. One is the weight. It just seemed like it was a little thicker, a few mil thicker, and it has a higher weight recommendation. So this works a little better with my weight. I feel like size-wise, I'm kind of in between the 58 and the 54, but I'd rather go smaller than bigger. Where I feel like the 58 starts to feel a little more aggressive, a little more like the flight attendant, which this is a lot like. This is basically a more directional, more setback flight attendant, especially setback on board. And it really has like that fun kind of like a feel that works with that short, fat, surfy kind of thing. And it's not quite as setback and surfy as the stun gun, but it's a lot more than the flight attendant. And so, you know, one thing I did notice is comparing my 17 that I owned and loved to my 19 on Burton's site for 2019, 18, and 17. They say the reference location is 50 mil back. On this board, the 2019 board says it's 25 mil back. Not sure who's right. It looks like it's still 50 mil back, and this might be a typo, but it might not be. But what I did notice is the setback on board is almost the same. It might only be like a 1/4 inch, more like an 1/8 of an inch difference, maybe even less. So overall, it seems like the same board, but who knows who's right or who's wrong, if the board's right or Burton's site is right. But regardless, it feels very similar. And I loved the board I had from 17 because it was made in Vermont at the Craig's facility. I think the 18, I can't remember if it's, or I don't know if it was made in China or in Austria. And then the 19 is definitely made in China. So, you know, it's a different board, but you get a lower price point. And you can see it's just got a healthy bow of camber going to a very mellow early rise that starts just a little bit before the nose. So it does a lot to compensate for that camber. It kinks up a little more than most of the other snowboards these days in the nose. You know, it tips up a little more, but it still just does an amazing job. And then you've got all this pop, and that's what I love about this board. It just pops, it drives. Burton understands how to make maybe one of the best like camber board. You know, their camber dominant to full camber boards just have so much pop, such a lively, fun personality underfoot, without being too overly aggressive. They still have a cool flex to it. And you know, Burton does that. And speaking of, the way this board turns is something really cool. There's like, they call it balanced free ride geometry or something to that extent. But basically, they give you a lot of taper, 10 mil of taper in this board, which isn't a massive amount for you know, such a directional tapered, you know, short, fat, surfy kind of ride. But so many boards I've ridden that have 10 mil or even less than 10 mil feel more washy than this. So it's very interesting. They're doing something with either the side cut, you know, with like multiple radius side cut to kind of balance that out as you get to the tail, or maybe they're just starting the side cut a little lower. You know, so it's the same width. Whatever they're doing, it feels less tapered and washy, less off the back foot than it normally does, and that's pretty cool. So you can drive a little more between the feet. It still likes a little more, you know, it's still a little washy. It still likes to be off that back foot, but it's a lot less than you would think for that amount of taper. Now, getting into setback on board, you're looking at, you know, just like a reference stance of like almost 21. It's like 20 3/4. And then when you set back all the way, you're looking at almost 22. I think it's 21 3/4, which is very doable for most. And then at that setback of 21 3/4, you're looking at 24 to the back insert with, you know, if you follow these little, the suggested area, the area in black here, you know, these are the suggested areas to be. If you have non-EST bindings, you can go a lot further back than they suggest, but I stay with that. And then you have 13 1/4 versus 24, so that's 10.75 back on board. But here's the thing, there's just a little notch here that isn't massive. And if you measure the difference between this notch, it comes to about 1 inch, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. Let's see here. You know, just about an inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch. So you could say this is probably more 10 inches back on board versus the stun gun, which is like more of a true like 10.75. Maybe that's why it feels a little more off the tail, a little more surfy. And also it has a little more taper than this, like 2 mil more of taper. But so you can get really far back on board, especially when you compare this to the flight attendant. But for me, I like riding the 59 flight attendant and the 54 skeleton key. Probably, you know, I'm kind of in that in-between realm, like I said before. But, you know, you've got a nice clear base. This isn't die cut. This is all just clear base with black underneath and kind of like a nice graphic underneath that kind of is away from the effective edge. So if you hit something, you can use clear PTEX and a PTEX gun, and you know, it'll still look pretty if you want to keep this for a long time and make it pretty. But all in all, I mean, this Burton skeleton key is just a fun ride. I love having it in my quiver. It's been a favorite for a long time. And you know, this and the flight attendant are probably two of my favorite boards that Burton's made, you know, in the last 5 or 10 years. You know, it all comes down to personal preference and what you're looking for. But this skeleton key can be really a fun either quiver ride or kind of your all-around ride. I'd say its only detraction is the edge hold isn't quite as strong as boards with similar camber profiles, but hey, you know, it still holds a pretty good edge, and it's still a very fun board that you can just carve up groomers when the snow's good and get pretty good float and powder. This is a fun board for me in the trees. I don't like it when it's super deep. This isn't like perfect super deep, but it's got such good float for this kind of camber profile. And that setback on board, the rocker in the nose, and the taper in the tail really negates that, like all that camber, and really makes it a fun board to float. So there you have it. That's the Burton Skeleton Key 2019.